When you really look at the American story, there's this deep contradiction at its very core. On one hand, there's this incredible promise of liberty, but on the other, there's a long, complicated history of expansion, of conquest, and of intervention. So in this explainer, we're going to trace that story to figure out how the United States became a global superpower and what that means for its role in the world right now.
We've all heard these words, right? It's the end of the Pledge of Allegiance, the foundational promise of the entire country. It's a really powerful ideal, but how well does it actually stack up against history?
Well, right from the very beginning, you see this clash between the ideal and the reality. Take the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. It was passed because people were terrified of foreign influence from the French Revolution, and it gives the government the power to just arrest and deport non-citizens without a trial. And get this, it's still on the books today. It was even used to help justify the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. It just goes to show you, there's a long pattern of creating these exceptions to America's highest ideals, usually driven by fear.
So, where did this all start? Where does this contradiction really come from? Well, to get to the bottom of it, we have to go way back, to the very beginning, to a concept that Thomas Jefferson himself called the Empire of Liberty. Let's dig into how that idea really got started.
Okay, this line, it's probably the most famous part of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, for its time, it was a truly revolutionary idea, but it also begs a really important question. Who exactly did they mean by all men?
Yeah, this is where you have to read the fine print of the founding era. The men who wrote the Declaration, many of whom, by the way, owned slaves, had a very, very narrow definition of who counted as a human being. Their idea of equality deliberately left out Native Americans, enslaved black people, and all women. And that single decision laid the groundwork for centuries of hypocrisy and conflict.
And this selective idea of who counted as a person, well, it got supercharged in the 19th century with an ideology called manifest destiny. This was a key part of what's known as American exceptionalism, this belief that the U.S. was special, that it was chosen by God, and it wasn't just about getting more land. It was this potent mix of old Puritan beliefs and what was essentially racial pseudoscience, which claimed the Anglo-Saxon race was destined to rule the whole continent.
And this wasn't just some abstract idea. Oh no. This belief in a divine right to expand, it was put into action with shocking efficiency, and it completely redrew the map of North America in just a few decades. Just look at how fast this all happened. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 wasn't about buying governed land. It was about buying the right to conquer it from the people who already lived there. Then Florida was taken from a weak Spanish empire. By 1848, after annexing Texas, the U.S. went to war with Mexico and ended up seizing about a third of their entire country.
And the reality of this expansion was just incredibly violent. If you want to understand how violent it was, just look at this number. $12. That's it. That was the price the U.S. government paid its citizens for every single Native American scalp they turned in during the 19th century. This wasn't some unfortunate side effect of expansion. This was state-sanctioned murder.
And this way of thinking wasn't some hidden secret. It was right out in the open. This quote from a popular magazine at the time just lays it all out. "We are chosen. This land is our inheritance, and we must drive everyone else out." That was the moral green light, right there, the justification for conquering a continent.
So what happens when you run out of continent to conquer? Well, by the end of the 1800s, manifest destiny didn't just disappear. It evolved. The focus shifted from taking land to intervening in the business of other countries, especially right here in America's own backyard.
The playbook for this was something called the Monroe Doctrine. Now, originally, it was just a warning to Europe to stay out of the Americas. But later on, guys like Teddy Roosevelt basically rewrote it to mean that the U.S. had the right to intervene whenever, wherever it wanted in Latin America. It effectively made the U.S. the self-appointed policeman of the entire region.
As America started flexing its muscles, other world powers definitely started to notice. In 1913, while the U.S. was getting involved in a coup down in Mexico, the British Foreign Secretary asked this really critical question. Okay, if you're going to intervene, what's the endgame?
And the answer that came back from the U.S. ambassador, wow, it's just incredibly telling. The new mission wasn't about taking their land anymore. It was about forcing an American-style government on them, no matter how long it took or how much violence was needed. This is basically Manifest Destiny 2.0. It's this idea that it's America's duty to remake the world in its own image, an early version of what we now call nation building.
Then came the two world wars and the Cold War, and everything changed. This is when America really becomes the global superpower we know today, with alliances all over the world. And the excuse for its actions changed again. It wasn't about destiny or good governance anymore. Now it was about stopping an existential threat. First Nazism, then Soviet communism.
But this led to a massive contradiction, a real paradox at the heart of U.S. foreign policy. To stop the spread of communism, the U.S. often supported some of the most brutal, anti-democratic dictators on the planet, from Pinochet in Chile to the Shah in Iran. So the goal of protecting freedom often meant sacrificing democracy on the ground.
And you really can't talk about this period without talking about Vietnam. It's the perfect case study of how this policy could just spectacularly backfire. The Nixon administration knew the war was unwinnable, but they refused to admit defeat. So they tried to Vietnamize it, pull U.S. troops out and just pay for the South Vietnamese army to do the fighting. But the strategy, which was really all about ego, completely failed. The corrupt government there collapsed, creating the exact image of American defeat they were so desperate to avoid.
So the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. And suddenly, the US is the last one standing. This was called the unipolar moment, a time when there was only one dominant power in the world. But being on top came with its own set of problems, and led to some really controversial decisions that started to chip away at America's credibility and trust around the globe.
The 2003 invasion of Iraq, which we now know was based on false information, was a huge turning point. That, plus the horrific images of prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib and the legal black hole of Guantanamo Bay, all of it seriously damaged America's image as a champion of human rights. It made it a lot harder to lead when everyone could just point to the hypocrisy.
And the really crucial thing here is that people on the inside knew this was happening. Richard Haass, who was a senior diplomat for multiple presidents, gave this just stunningly honest assessment. He basically admitted that the modern policy of regime change was a total failure, and that it directly created the instability that we're still dealing with today.
Which, of course, brings us to today. That unipolar moment is over. The United States is now facing a world that it can no longer control by itself, and that's sparking a huge debate about what its future role should be and just how stable its network of alliances really is.
The world we live in now is totally different. It's become a multipolar world. You have rising powers like China and a newly aggressive Russia that are openly challenging American leadership. It's not a two-player game anymore. The old strategies don't really work, and the U.S. now has to fight for influence while its old allies are getting more and more nervous.
And that leaves us with this one big final question. For over 200 years, the United States has defined itself with this complicated and often contradictory mix of high-minded ideals and raw power. Looking at that history and facing the new challenges of today, can it, or even should it, continue to see itself as the world's custodian of freedom?